I never imagined my grandfather's well would spark a vicious battle with the HOA, but that's exactly what happened when Margaret Wilson dumped concrete into it while I was away on a business trip. She thought she'd won, enforcing her iron grip on Willow Creek Estate's pristine uniformity, but she had no clue I'd been setting a legal trap for months, anticipating her overreach. It started the day I inherited Grandpa Joe's farmhouse, a sprawling 5-acre property with a stone well that had quenched the land's thirst for over a century. The lawyer handed me a yellowed envelope with trembling hands, saying, "Your grandfather was adamant you have this." And inside was a hand-drawn map, the well marked proudly at its heart, along with documents exempting the property from HOA rules, terms Grandpa had negotiated when the neighborhood formed in 1982. I moved in 2 months later, the farmhouse weathered but the land breathtaking, the well standing like a sentinel in the side yard, its stone circle a relic of simpler times. I spent my first weekend clearing weeds and fixing its wooden roof, feeling Grandpa's presence as I worked. He'd taught me to draw water from it when I was 8, his calloused hands guiding mine. The Thompsons, my next-door neighbors, welcomed me with muffins, Sarah saying, "We're thrilled someone's here again. Your grandfather was a gem," while David warned, "The HOA's gotten stricter. Watch out for the new board member." I laughed it off, showing them the exemption papers, and their relief should have tipped me off that trouble was brewing, but I was too busy settling in to notice. Then Margaret Wilson appeared, a shadow across my vegetable garden 3 days later, her tracksuit pristine, her ponytail tight, her sunglasses hiding her eyes despite the overcast sky. "You must be Joe's grandchild," she said, skipping pleasantries. "I'm the HOA vice president, and that well's an eyesore. Unapproved water features violate our standards." I explained the exemption calmly, but her smile hardened as she snapped photos, citing community standards and documenting violations, her manicured finger jabbing the air. That night, a certified letter arrived. 3 violations: unapproved exterior features, non-compliant landscaping, unsafe structures, each with a $100 daily fine, pushing me to dig through Grandpa's oak desk, where I found the 1982 agreement confirming the property's historical status, structures grandfathered in perpetuity. The next evening, Julia Johnson, an elderly neighbor, knocked softly, whispering, "I saw Margaret at your fence. She's dangerous. She filled our koi pond last year while we were away, claiming it was a mosquito hazard." Her trembling hands told a story of HOA tyranny. Sheds demolished, gates removed, all while owners were absent. And I realized Margaret's vendetta wasn't just about rules. It was personal, though I didn't yet know why. Sleepless, I stood by the well that night, its cool stones grounding me, and decided to act. I called a water rights attorney, a security company, and the State Historical Society, who confirmed the well's rarity could earn it protection. Cameras went up, some hidden, some visible, around my property, and my attorney, Elaine Morales, reviewed the exemption, saying, "This is ironclad, but document everything." So I did, logging every notice, every encounter, preparing for a fight I hoped wouldn't come. But deep down, I knew Margaret wouldn't stop, and I was right. Margaret Wilson didn't waste time escalating her campaign against my grandfather. Well, leading a parade of HOA inspections past my house over the next few weeks, each visit spawning more violation notices that piled up like autumn leaves. I presented Grandpa's exemption documents at the next HOA meeting, expecting reason to prevail, but Margaret dismissed them with a smirk, claiming they needed verification from the board's attorney, her confidence unshaken. Letters from neighbors started arriving, some backing her crusade for uniformity, others urging me to fight quietly, like the Thompsons, who brought dinner one night, Sarah whispering, "She's splitting the neighborhood, but many of us are fed up with her bullying." David nodded, mentioning the Rodriguez family's battle over their house color, and I realized this was bigger than my well. It was a power grab dressed up as community standards. I had to leave for a week-long business trip, my gut churning with unease as I checked the cameras, locked the house, and asked the Thompsons to watch the property, telling myself the well had survived a century. It could handle one nosy neighbor. Driving away, I clung to the preparations I'd made. The Historical Society application, the security footage, the waterproofed exemption copy tucked by the well, steps taken out of caution, not knowing they'd soon become my lifeline. When I returned, rain hammering my windshield, My headlights caught a gray lump where the well should have been, and my heart sank as I stumbled out, flashlight revealing a concrete plug, the wooden roof splintered nearby. A deliberate act of destruction that hit me like a punch. Kneeling in the mud, I ran my hands over the hardened concrete, fury building as Margaret watched from her porch, her bathrobe a mockery of innocence, her smile visible even through the downpour. I stormed toward her, demanding, "What did you do to my well?" And she replied coolly, "The board voted it a safety hazard. You ignored the notices," handing me a document citing an emergency provision, her voice dripping with fake concern about children falling in. I called the police, rain soaking me as I explained, but the officer shrugged. "Civil matter. Take it to court," leaving me to sift through my security footage that night, which showed Margaret directing a concrete truck onto my land the day after I left, workers pouring while she pointed, smug and unstoppable. Morning brought me to Thomas Reed, the HOA president, who paled at the footage, stammering, "I didn't know. She called an emergency meeting, said it'd be a safety cover, not concrete." He admitted she'd misled the board with fake paperwork, and my attorney, Elaine, seized on it when I showed her, her eyes gleaming as she said, "This is beyond HOA authority. Destroying a water source is illegal, and with your historical registration approved 3 days ago, it's criminal vandalism of a protected site." The trap I'd laid, cameras, documents, historical status, had snapped shut, and as neighbors like Julia Johnson offered support, bringing photos of Margaret measuring the well beforehand, I filed a lawsuit against her and the HOA, nomming her actions for what they were. That night, a brick crashed through my window with a note, "Drop the lawsuit or worse." And as the police bagged it, I knew Margaret had underestimated me, but I wondered just how far she'd go to win. The brick through my window marked a turning point. Margaret Wilson's war on my grandfather's well had gone from petty HOA nonsense to outright intimidation, and I wasn't backing down. The police took the threat seriously this time, a local news van soon parking outside my house after an anonymous tip about HOA terrorism. And I decided to speak, telling the camera, "I just want my well restored. It's my water source and this community's history." The segment aired at 10, and by morning, my phone buzzed with messages from strangers sharing their own HOA nightmares, while Margaret countered with flyers on every door, claiming I was tanking property values with my dangerous water hole, splitting Willow Creek estates into warring factions. I retrieved my mail under the glares of her supporters, only for Margaret to approach with 2 burly men, her voice low. "You've made a mistake. That well's not historical and records can change. Accidents can happen." Her escorts, claiming to be HOA-hired inspectors, demanded access to my home, but I refused without a court order, noticing one had a tattoo matching the brick note's handwriting, a chill running through me as they left. I called Elaine, my attorney, packing an overnight bag as she advised. "Document this. It's escalation. Stay elsewhere tonight and I'll file for an emergency hearing." Hiding at a friend. I pored over Grandpa's papers, Margaret's cryptic jab about his innocence nagging at me, but the next day brought allies. 3 HOA board members contacted me, disavowing her actions, and Thomas Reed confirmed they'd testify she'd acted alone. Elaine called. The judge had fast-tracked our case due to the historical damage, and as I visited the concrete-filled well at dusk, Margaret appeared, smirking, "Enjoying your new feature?" Her confidence unshaken until I mentioned the historical registration, watching her falter before she hissed, "You'll regret this." Yellow flyers hit every mailbox by dawn, screaming, "Emergency HOA meeting. Resident threatens community values," painting me as a villain with forged documents, but Elaine saw it as a gift, proof of malicious intent. Returning from the store, I found my yard littered with signs, "Comply or leave." "Wells kill property values." Margaret's crew watching for a reaction, I denied them, photographing each one instead. That night, Mrs. Jenkins, my elderly neighbor, slipped to my back door, whispering, "Margaret's planning something. She's hired someone to challenge your registration and says you threatened her." Lies that fueled my resolve as I thanked her for risking Margaret's wrath. Then my dog Max vanished from the backyard, the gate still locked, and after hours of searching, a text from the Johnsons pointed me to Margaret's shed. Officer Rivera met me there, forcing her to open it, revealing Max, dehydrated but alive, her excuse flimsy as footage showed her luring him away. The emergency HOA meeting she'd called became her undoing. Neighbors packed the community center, tension thick as she railed against my unsightly well. But I countered with historical documents and photos of preserved landmarks, keeping calm. Thomas dropped the bombshell, showing altered papers she'd used to trick the board, announcing, "We never approved concrete. The HOA severs ties with Margaret and supports restoration." She stormed out, hissing, "This isn't over," as apologies poured in from neighbors she'd bullied too. Driving home, my brakes failed. My mechanic found the lines cut, fluid still dripping, and as police investigated, I stared at Margaret's lit window, realizing this fight had turned deadly, the court hearing just days away. The courtroom buzzed as Judge Reynolds entered, my pulse hammering while Elaine squeezed my hand, whispering, "We've got this," though Margaret sat across the aisle, her smug mask intact beside her high-priced lawyer. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "This is one of the most disturbing property disputes I've seen in 15 years. Setting the tone as Elaine laid out our case. Security footage of Margaret directing the concrete pour at dawn, the well's historical registration, and Thomas Reed's testimony that no emergency vote had occurred. 3 more board members backed him, exposing her forged paperwork, the forgery expert highlighting discrepancies on-screen as Margaret's face reddened, her lawyer's water glass toppling when she shoved him in frustration. Elaine dropped the bombshell. "This wasn't just an HOA overstep. It's criminal vandalism of a protected site, and police found Ms. Wilson's fingerprints on my client's car after the brake lines were cut." Margaret exploded. "He's tormented me for months. That well ruins property values." But Judge Reynolds silenced her with a gavel bang, her outburst only deepening the hole she'd dug. During the break, neighbors like Mrs. Johnson confessed Margaret's pattern, her koi pond destroyed with similar lies, while her lawyer pivoted, claiming she'd acted in good faith, a defense Elaine shredded with the lack of prior violations on my record. Then the judge asked, "Did you consult the water authority before filling a registered well?" And Margaret stammered, "It wasn't necessary for an eyesore," only for Reynolds to retort, "A functioning well ties to water rights. You violated riparian law." The ruling came fast. Full restoration costs, $175,000 in punitive damages, Margaret's HOA expulsion, and a restraining order. Victory sweeter than I'd dared hope, though her parting shot as deputies blocked her rang in my ears. "Your grandfather wasn't innocent. Ask about the Henderson deal in '76. Outside, reporters swarmed. "How does it feel to win?" And I replied, "It's not about winning, it's about stopping abuse," spotting an elderly man with a cane across the street, his nod stirring an eerie familiarity I couldn't place. That night, haunted by Margaret's words, I searched Henderson property deal in the county database, coffee cooling as the well's restoration loomed, my gut telling me there was more to uncover. A knock jolted me. Through the peephole, that same man, Frank Henderson, rasped, "Margaret mentioned my family, didn't she?" And against my instincts, I let him in, his leather folder hitting my table as he explained. "Your grandfather and I were partners 60 years ago. He saved my farm in '76 when drought hit, funding irrigation while Margaret's father tried to steal our land for cheap." He sighed. "Her family spread lies. He swindled us. He took the fall to shield us from her dad's bank fraud." Next morning, as workers drilled the concrete, Frank's tail gnawed at me. Then Thomas Reed called, frantic. "They found something in the well." I raced out to a crowd around a waterproof metal box, hidden in a chamber, packed with deeds, bank records, and photos proving Grandpa sold land to Margaret's parents with covenants protecting natural features, water rights reverting to us if breached. Elaine pounced. "This invalidates her property claim. Her father embezzled using rural land as collateral." And by afternoon, reporters camped outside as the county clerk verified the documents, stamped 49 years ago. Margaret's attorney cried forgery, but the truth was surfacing, and I knew court loomed again. This time, she'd lose more than her pride. The discovery of the metal box in my grandfather's well flipped everything. Deeds, bank records, and photos proving Margaret Wilson's family had built their wealth on fraud, tied to covenants that protected my land's natural features, now breached by her concrete stunt. Elaine, my attorney, spread the documents across my table, her voice electric. This isn't just about the well anymore. Her property title's invalid. Her father gifted it through a trust, but these covenants mean she never legally owned it. By afternoon, reporters swarmed my yard as the county clerk confirmed the papers. Authenticity, stamped in 1976, while Margaret's attorney fired back with a flimsy, convenient fabrications claim that fooled no one. 3 days later, we faced Judge Reynolds again, the courtroom humming as Elaine argued. Ms. Wilson didn't just vandalize a landmark. She tried to bury evidence of her family's fraudulent land grab, targeting my client, well to erase the proof. Margaret sat hollow-eyed, her new lawyer scrambling as Elaine presented the deeds, clear language stating natural features like my well, the Johnson's pond, and 6 other historical elements couldn't be altered without reverting ownership to my family, conditions her father's embezzlement had hidden. She signed trust documents acknowledging these encumbrances, Elaine pressed, and the lawyer's weak retort. She had no knowledge of ancient agreements, crumbled under property records tying her to the fraud. Judge Reynolds studied the evidence, her voice steady. These covenants are binding. Ms. Wilson's deliberate violations nullify her ownership. She must vacate within 30 days, and criminal charges for the break tampering proceed separately. Margaret collapsed in tears, the room murmuring as neighbors outside peppered me with questions, Frank Henderson at the crowd's edge, saying, "Your grandfather hid those papers knowing justice would wake someday." The fallout hit fast. Margaret pleaded guilty to criminal mischief for cutting my break lines, dodging jail with community service cataloging historical features, an irony not lost on anyone. The HOA dissolved, replaced by a heritage committee that championed unique properties over conformity. My well soon a registered landmark with a plaque detailing its century-long story. On the day it pumped clean water again, neighbors gathered, Thomas Reed handing me an envelope found behind the HOA charter, addressed to my property's future owner. Inside, Grandpa's letter from 40 years ago. "If you're reading this, someone," challenged the well, "water reveals truth when it flows free. Protect what matters, not what seems proper." I traced those words, feeling his wisdom echo through the fight I'd won, not just for the well, but for a community tired of bullies. Months later, Willow Creek Estates felt reborn. Neighbors who'd shunned me now waved. The uniformity obsession replaced by pride in our quirks, the well a symbol of resilience. Margaret's house sold quietly, her absence a relief, though her final jab about Grandpa lingered until Frank's tale and the documents proved he'd been a savior, not a swindler. Standing by the well, I often thought of his letter. Water did bring life, but also unearthed secrets like her family's shame, buried until I'd fought to free it. The battle had cost me sleepless nights, a slashed break line, and a yard full of hate signs, but it gave me something greater. The courage he'd passed down, the kind that waits for the right moment to rise, and the clarity to know what's worth defending when the world tries to pave it over. The restored well gleamed under the sun as water flowed freely again, its gentle gurgle a victory hymn after months of chaos, and I stood there clutching Grandpa's letter, his words. Water reveals truth when it flows free, ringing truer than ever. Neighbors mingled around it, their chatter lively during the impromptu celebration, the Heritage Committee's first gathering since the HOA's collapse, and Thomas Reed toasted, "To history and standing up," his eyes meeting mine with a nod of respect. The plaque beside the well, etched with its century-long tale, drew curious glances. Kids ran fingers over the stone, asking about the concrete lady, while adults swapped stories of Margaret's reign, her absence lifting a weight none had named until it was gone. I felt lighter too, though her courthouse jab about Grandpa's past still tugged at me. A loose thread Frank Henderson had started unraveling with his visit. Frank's revelation about the 1976 Henderson deal had rewritten my understanding. Grandpa hadn't swindled anyone. He'd saved Frank's farm from Margaret's father, a crooked banker who'd tried to snatch it during a drought, only to smear Grandpa when his own fraud risked exposure. The metal box from the well backed it up, deeds with covenants locking the land's natural features in place, bank records showing her dad's embezzlement, photos of Grandpa and Frank shaking hands by an irrigation ditch, all hidden to protect the truth until I'd forced it out. Margaret's obsession with the well wasn't just HOA control. It was a desperate bid to bury her family's shame, a grudge older than me, fueled by lies she'd inherited and wielded like a weapon until they crumbled in court. That night, alone with a glass of well water, crisp and cold like Grandpa always bragged. I spread the documents across my table, piecing together how he'd played the long game, agreeing to silence about the bank fraud if Margaret's father left the Hendersons alone, a deal that spared lives but stained his name. The covenants were his insurance, ensuring the well and its kin would outlast the Wilsons' greed. And I'd stumbled into his plan, my legal trap. Cameras, historical registration, relentless evidence echoing his foresight without me even knowing it. Elaine had laughed when we last spoke, saying, "You're your grandfather's grandson, all right. He'd be proud." And I smiled, wondering if he'd foreseen Margaret's downfall, her own arrogance the key that unlocked his buried justice. Willow Creek estates had changed. Uniform lawns gave way to quirky gardens. The Rodriguez family's bright house stood unchallenged, and Mrs. Jenkins' roses bloomed defiantly, all under the Heritage Committee's watch, which I'd joined to keep Grandpa's legacy alive. Margaret's community service sentence, cataloging those same features she'd destroyed, felt like poetic payback, though I heard she'd moved to a condo across town, her influence a fading echo. The well drew visitors now, neighbors and strangers alike, asking about the fight, and I'd tell them it wasn't just about water. It was about roots, about what we choose to preserve when others demand we conform. Running my hand over the stone, I'd think of Grandpa teaching me to draw the bucket up, his quiet strength in every pull, and realize the real inheritance wasn't the land or the well, but the grit to stand firm, a lesson carved into me as deep as the well was dug. The well's steady trickle became my morning ritual, a quiet reminder of the storm I'd weathered, and as I sipped its water, sharp and pure, I'd marvel at how Willow Creek Estates had shed Margaret Wilson's shadow, her vendetta now just a story neighbors told over fences. The Heritage Committee thrived, meeting monthly in my living room, where we mapped out protections for quirks like Mr. Finch's rebuilt shed and the Johnsons' restored pond, turning the neighborhood into a patchwork of pride rather than a sterile grid. Kids played near the well, their laughter bouncing off the stone, while parents asked me to retell the tale. How a concrete plug sparked a legal war that toppled an HOA tyrant, and I'd point to Grandpa's plaque, saying, "It's his victory too," feeling his presence in every word. Yet beneath the calm, Margaret's final courthouse snarl, "He wasn't so innocent," lingered, a riddle I'd solved with Frank Henderson's help, though it left me wondering what else he'd buried. Frank visited again one crisp afternoon, his cane tapping my porch as he carried a faded photo of him and Grandpa by the well, young and grinning, a snapshot from before the Henderson deal turned sour. "Your grandfather knew the Wilsons wouldn't stop," he said, voice gravelly. "So he hid those papers to outlast them, thought they'd try to rewrite history, and they did till you came along." The documents had done more than win a lawsuit. They'd rewritten Margaret's legacy, her father's fraud laid bare, her house lost to the covenants he'd signed, and Frank's quiet nod as he left felt like absolution for a man I'd never doubted but now understood deeper. I kept the photo by the well, a tether to the past that made the present sweeter, knowing Grandpa's silence had been strategy, not shame. Margaret's absence didn't erase her mark entirely. Her community service reports trickled in, dry lists of historical features she cataloged with grudging precision, and I'd spot her name in the local paper, a ghost of the power she'd wielded. The neighborhood healed around her void, the Thompsons hosting barbecues where we'd laugh about the concrete days, and Julia Johnson gifted me a koi fish for my garden, saying, "For the fight you finished." I'd sit by the well at dusk, tracing Grandpa's letter, protect what matters, not what appears proper, and see how it guided me through flyers, threats, and cut-break lines, a compass I hadn't known I'd needed until Margaret forced me to use it. The water flowed freer now, unburdened by her grudge, and I'd think of Frank's farm, saved by that same well's spirit, a ripple of justice stretching decades. Sometimes I'd catch neighbors staring at the well, not with fear but wonder, asking, "How'd you know to fight?" And I'd shrug, "I didn't, Grandpa did," pointing to the stone he'd laid, the exemption he'd secured, the trap he'd set long before I was born. The real win wasn't the lawsuit or the restored water. It was inheriting his knack for seeing through the noise, for planting roots that wouldn't budge when someone like Margaret swung an axe. As winter crept in, I'd wrap up by the well, watching frost kiss the stone and feel a quiet pride. Not just in the land, but in the stubborn streak that kept it mine. A gift from a man who'd known truth waits, patient as water for the right time to rise. Winter settled over Willow Creek Estates, the well's stone edges glinting with ice, and I'd stand there in the quiet, breath fogging as I traced Grandpa's legacy. Not just the water flowing beneath, but the fight it had sparked, a battle that reshaped a neighborhood and me along with it. The Heritage Committee's work hummed along, codifying protections for every unique corner. The Rodriguez's vibrant house, Mrs. Jenkins, roses, my well's plaque a beacon of what we'd reclaimed. And neighbors stopped by often, their kids tossing pebbles into the water, asking, "Did the concrete lady really lose her house?" I'd nod, pointing to the covenants in Grandpa's hidden box, and tell them, "She picked the wrong well to mess with," grinning as they ran off, the story already folklore. Margaret's name faded from conversation, her community service a distant hum, though I'd spot her condo listing in the paper, a final retreat from the empire she'd tried to rule. Frank Henderson's last visit stuck with me. He'd shuffled up one snowy day, pressing a worn journal into my hands, Grandpa's handwriting scrawled across pages detailing the Henderson deal, the bank's threats, and his choice to bury the truth rather than bury Frank's family. "He wrote you'd find it someday," Frank rasped. "Said water keeps secrets till they're ready." And as he left, I read by the well, the journal's final line echoing his letter. "What's buried isn't gone, just waiting." It hit me then, Grandpa hadn't just saved the well for me. He'd armed me to finish what he couldn't, outsmarting Margaret's kin across generations, his silence a shield until I swung it like a sword. The documents, the cameras, the historical registration, they weren't luck. They were his plan, and I'd walked it blind till the end. Spring brought new life. Green shoots around the well, neighbors planting gardens that defied the old HOA's rules. And I'd sit there with the journal sipping water that tasted like triumph, knowing Margaret's grudge had unearthed more than she'd bargained for. Her father's fraud, her lost title, her banishment. They were fallout from a war she'd started, thinking a concrete truck could erase history, but Grandpa's foresight and my stubbornness proved otherwise. The Thompsons threw a picnic that May, the well's pump chugging as we toasted to no more tyrants. And Julia Johnson whispered, "You gave us back our spine." Her coy fish tail a mirror to mine, a community stitched together by battles won around that stone circle. Now when I draw water, I see more than a well. I see Grandpa's hands guiding mine, his voice in the letter urging me to protect what matters, and the truth it flushed out, clear as the stream before me. Margaret thought she'd crush a nuisance. Instead, she cracked open a vault, exposing her family's rot and handing me a legacy I hadn't known I'd earned. The neighborhood thrives because of it, quirky, free, a testament to standing firm. And I'll keep the well running, not just for water, but for the lesson it carved into me. Courage isn't loud, it's patient, waiting like water in stone for the moment to break through. Running my fingers over the plaque, I smile, knowing the real inheritance was never the land. It was the grit to fight for it. A gift from Grandpa that outlasted concrete, threats, and time itself, flowing as steady as the well he left behind.